What if I told you there's an ancient Jewish text so powerful, so revealing about creation and heaven's secrets, that religious authorities felt they had to hide it from the world for nearly 2,000 years? I'm talking about a book that doesn't just tell you what happened in the Garden of Eden, it tells you the names of the angels who watched it unfold. A book that doesn't simply mention the flood, it gives you the exact date, down to the day and month when the waters began to rise. This isn't some newly discovered manuscript or modern interpretation. This is a text that existed before the birth of Christianity, before the Second Temple fell, before the world as we know it took shape. And yet, somewhere along the journey of history, powerful people decided you shouldn't read it. This book names the angels who fell from grace. It reveals the precise calendar that God Himself gave to Moses on Mount Sinai. It explains mysteries that Genesis only hints at, filling in the gaps that have left scholars puzzled for millennia. It tells you why certain laws exist, what the heavenly tablets contain, and how the entire timeline of creation was mapped out before a single human drew breath. For centuries, this text was cherished, studied, and revered. Then something changed. Religious leaders grew uncomfortable. Questions were raised, debates erupted, and slowly, deliberately, this book was pushed into the shadows, removed from official canons, whispered about in hushed tones rather than proclaimed from mountaintops. So I ask you again, why was it banned? What truth was so dangerous that it couldn't be allowed to spread freely among the faithful? Let me tell you about the Book of Jubilees. Imagine holding a manuscript written around 160 years before the Common Era, roughly 2,180 years ago. The Jewish people called it Little Genesis because it retells the entire story from creation through the moment Moses received the law on Mount Sinai, but with extraordinary detail that will make your spine tingle. Picture this. The author claims that an angel of the presence, one of the highest-ranking celestial beings in heaven's hierarchy, dictated this entire account to Moses while he stood on that sacred mountain. Not just the commandments, but the whole story, the complete timeline, the hidden meanings behind every event, from Adam's first breath to the Israelites receiving the covenant. Here's what makes your heart race when you first encounter this text. It doesn't speak in the vague, poetic language we sometimes struggle to interpret. It gives you dates, exact dates. It tells you that creation didn't just happen over 7 days, it happened in the first week of the first month of the first year of the world's first Jubilee cycle. It explains that a Jubilee is 49 years, and then maps out all of human history in these cycles, giving you a cosmic calendar that organizes everything from Adam's creation to the establishment of the priesthood. You can follow along, counting the years, watching history unfold with mathematical precision that feels almost prophetic, as if someone had access to the very blueprint of time itself. The Book of Jubilees was treasured throughout ancient Jewish communities. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in caves near Qumran, contained at least 15 different copies of this book. 15 copies. Think about what that means. In an era when every single manuscript had to be painstakingly copied by hand, when parchment was precious and scribal work was exhausting, this community chose to preserve 15 copies of Jubilees. They valued it enough to dedicate countless hours to reproducing it, storing it, protecting it in those caves where it would wait 2,000 years to tell us just how important it once was. But here's where the story takes a turn that might resonate with something you felt in your own life. You know that feeling when you speak a truth that makes people uncomfortable? When you say something real, something that challenges the status quo, and suddenly the room goes quiet? When you can feel the shift in energy as people decide whether to embrace what you've said or reject it, because it disrupts their comfortable narratives? That's exactly what happened to the Book of Jubilees. For generations it was studied, quoted, referenced by religious teachers and spiritual seekers. Then, gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, it began to disappear from official collections. It wasn't banned in one dramatic moment with declarations and burnings. It was slowly, quietly marginalized, like a voice being turned down until it fades to silence. While the Jewish religious authorities were letting this book slip away, something remarkable was happening far to the south. In the highlands of Ethiopia, the Beta Israel community, the Ethiopian Jewish people, held on to this text as if their spiritual lives depended on it. And perhaps they did. While the rest of the world was forgetting, they were remembering. While others were discarding, they were preserving. They kept the Book of Jubilees in their canon of Scripture, copied it, taught from it, lived by its calendar and its laws. They became the guardians of knowledge that the mainstream wanted to forget. Doesn't that remind you of something? Haven't you ever felt like you were holding on to a truth that everyone else dismissed? Haven't you ever been the one who remembered what others chose to forget? The Ethiopian Christians did the same thing. They embraced this text, translated it, preserved it in Ge'ez, their classical language. For over 1,000 years, while European scholars had no idea this book even existed anymore, Ethiopian communities, both Jewish and Christian, were reading it in their services, teaching it to their children, living according to its wisdom. They didn't need permission from distant authorities to recognize truth when they encountered it. They didn't need a council to validate what their spirits already knew was sacred. And because of their faithfulness, because of their courage to stand apart from the majority opinion, we have this book today. Every copy we can now read in English, in Hebrew, in any modern language, traces back to those Ethiopian manuscripts, preserved by people who refused to let forbidden knowledge die. Here's what strikes me most powerfully about this story, and I wonder if you'll feel it too. The Book of Jubilees survived its own suppression. Think about the symbolism there. Think about what that means for your life right now. How many times have you felt like your voice was being suppressed? How many times have you carried knowledge, insight, or truth that others didn't want to hear? How many times have you been marginalized, pushed to the edges, made to feel like what you know doesn't matter? The Book of Jubilees is telling you something crucial. Truth has a way of enduring. What is meant to survive will survive. The wisdom that needs to reach future generations will find a way, even if it has to travel thousands of miles, hide in mountain caves, or be preserved by a community the mainstream forgot about. This text opens with God commanding the angel to write down everything that happened from creation until the building of the sanctuary so that Israel would know the divisions of time and never forget the covenant. Every festival, every Sabbath, every sacred moment is mapped out with precision, and woven throughout are stories that expand on Genesis in ways that make you sit up and pay attention. It tells you about the Watchers, those angels who descended to earth and taught forbidden knowledge to humanity. It names them. It describes their rebellion in detail that makes the brief mention in Genesis feel like just the opening line of a much longer, more complex story. It explains how the Nephilim, the giants, came to be and why the flood was necessary, to cleanse the earth of the corruption they introduced. The Book of Jubilees looks at you and says, "The calendar you're using is wrong." God gave Moses a perfect solar calendar of 364 days, divided into 4 equal seasons, with festivals falling on the same day of the week every single year. No confusion, no calculations needed, no debates about when to observe the sacred times, just perfect divine order. But humanity, in its wisdom or foolishness, chose different calendars, lunar cycles that shift and change, requiring constant adjustment. The book suggests this wasn't just a practical choice, it was a spiritual deviation, a move away from the divine pattern. And you have to wonder, what else have we deviated from? What other divine patterns have we replaced with human convenience? Right now, as you're listening to this, I know something about you. You're not here by accident. You didn't click on a video about a banned ancient text because you're satisfied with surface-level explanations. You're here because you sense there's more to the story than you've been told. You're here because something in you recognizes that truth is often found in the places we're told not to look. You're here because you're brave enough to seek wisdom even when it comes wrapped in the label forbidden. The Book of Jubilees was written for people exactly like you, people who want to understand not just what happened, but why it happened, how it fits into the grand design, what it means for how we should live. And that same hunger for deeper truth that drew you to this video is the same hunger that kept this book alive through 2 millennia of suppression. The religious authorities who eventually sidelined this text didn't do it because the Book of Jubilees was false. They did it because it was complicated. They did it because it demanded something from people that made them uncomfortable. And as we explore why this happened, I want you to pay attention to your own reaction, because the reasons this book was banned might reveal something about the challenges you're facing in your own spiritual journey right now. The first major controversy centered on something that seems almost mundane until you understand its implications: the calendar. The Book of Jubilees insists repeatedly and emphatically that God gave Moses a solar calendar of exactly 364 days, 52 perfect weeks, 4 seasons of exactly 13 weeks each, every festival falling on the same day of the week, year after year, with no variation, no confusion, no need for human calculation or priestly interpretation. The sacred days would arrive like clockwork, predictable as sunrise, ordained by divine mathematics rather than human observation of the moon. But here's the problem that made religious leaders deeply uncomfortable. The Jewish community had adopted a lunar calendar. The festivals moved. Passover didn't fall on the same day each year. The Day of Atonement shifted. Calculations were needed, decisions had to be made, and, most importantly, religious authorities had to tell people when to observe the holy days. Do you see what's happening here? The Book of Jubilees was threatening the authority structure itself. If God had given a perfect unchanging calendar that anyone could follow without priestly guidance, then what role did the religious establishment play? If the cosmic order was so clear that a simple farmer could know exactly when to observe the festivals without consulting the temple authorities, then power shifted from the institution to the individual. And institutions, whether ancient or modern, don't easily surrender that kind of control. You might know this feeling yourself. Maybe you've discovered a truth that didn't require an intermediary to access. Maybe you've found a direct connection to the divine that didn't need someone else's permission or interpretation. And maybe, just maybe, that made some people very uncomfortable. The calendar controversy went deeper than scheduling. It was about whether humanity could alter what God had established. The Book of Jubilees says explicitly that those who follow a different calendar are celebrating festivals at the wrong times, turning sacred days into ordinary days and ordinary days into sacred ones, disrupting the entire cosmic rhythm that God set in motion during Creation Week. Imagine being told that every festival you've celebrated, every holy day you've observed according to the accepted calendar, was actually happening at the wrong time. Imagine the psychological and spiritual impact of that revelation. Religious leaders faced an impossible choice: Admit that the community had been following an incorrect calendar for generations, causing massive upheaval and questioning of authority, or marginalize the text that made this claim. They chose the latter. But the calendar was just the beginning. The Book of Jubilees expands dramatically on the story of the Watchers, those mysterious beings mentioned briefly in Genesis chapter 6. It doesn't just tell you that angels descended and took human wives. It names them: Shemihaza, Asael, Armers, and 200 others. It describes how they made a pact together, binding themselves with mutual curses, knowing they were about to commit an act that would change the course of human history forever. It tells you that these angels taught humanity forbidden knowledge, the secrets of heaven, the cutting of roots for magic, the art of making weapons, the craft of cosmetics and adornment, the mysteries of astrology, and the movement of celestial bodies. Knowledge that was never meant for mortal minds. Here's where it gets prophetic in a way that might make your hands tremble. The book describes how this forbidden knowledge corrupted humanity, how people became obsessed with power, with altering their appearance, with trying to control their destinies through the stars, rather than trusting in divine providence. They learned to make swords and shields, knives and armor, and immediately turned to violence. They learned enchantments and became enslaved to superstition. They gained knowledge without wisdom, power without responsibility, and the earth filled with violence and perversion. Now, I want you to think about your world right now. Think about the technologies we've developed without considering the consequences. Think about the knowledge we've gained without the wisdom to use it properly. Think about how we've learned to alter everything from our bodies to our environments to the genetic code of life itself, all while losing touch with the sacred rhythms that should guide us. The Book of Jubilees was describing a pattern that repeats throughout human history, a warning that knowledge without righteousness leads to destruction. The religious authorities were uncomfortable with how much detail Jubilees provided about the angelic realm. It wasn't vague or metaphorical. It presented a specific hierarchy named individual beings, described their functions and their failures. Some leaders worried this gave too much attention to angels, that it might lead people into angel worship or dangerous speculation about the heavenly realms. They wanted the focus to remain strictly on God and the law, not on the complex cosmology that Jubilees revealed. But perhaps the real issue was that this book made the supernatural world too real, too present, too relevant to everyday life. It's easier to control people's behavior through laws and rules than to help them navigate a reality where angels and demons are active participants in the human story. The third controversy struck at the heart of religious authority itself. The Book of Jubilees contains laws that aren't in the Torah, additional commandments, extended explanations, specific applications that Moses received on the mountain, but that didn't make it into the 5 books of the Pentateuch. For example, it provides detailed laws about not eating blood that go beyond what Genesis or Leviticus specify. It includes regulations about ritual purity, about observing the Sabbath, about the proper way to offer sacrifices, that expand on or interpret the Torah's commands. Now, if you accept these as legitimate revelation given to Moses, then you have to follow them. But if you accept them as legitimate, you're also accepting that the Torah as you know it is incomplete, that there's authoritative divine law outside the accepted canon. And that question, that possibility, threatened the entire structure of how Scripture and authority functioned. Think about what this means for your life right now. How many times have you sensed that the official story was incomplete? How many times have you felt there was more to learn, more to understand, depths that weren't being taught or acknowledged? How many times have you been told that everything you need to know is contained in the accepted texts, the approved teachings, the official doctrines? only to discover that truth is wilder and deeper and more complex than the sanitized version you were given? The Book of Jubilees represents that uncomfortable reality that revelation doesn't always fit neatly into the boxes we create for it. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Jubilees for religious authorities was its teaching on predestination and heavenly tablets. The book repeatedly refers to tablets in heaven on which everything is written, predetermined before creation. Not just the laws, but the entire course of history, the fate of nations, the division between the righteous and the wicked. It suggests that before Adam took his first breath, God had already written out the story, established the covenant, determined the timeline. This raised profound theological questions about free will, about the nature of human choice, about whether our actions truly matter if everything is already inscribed on celestial tablets. These weren't questions religious leaders wanted common people wrestling with. These were the kinds of deep theological puzzles that could lead to confusion, despair, or worse, to people questioning whether their choices made any difference at all. But here's what the authorities failed to understand, what they couldn't suppress no matter how hard they tried. The Book of Jubilees survived precisely because it spoke to something deep in the human soul, something that recognizes truth even when that truth is difficult. While the Pharisaic community that would shape Rabbinic Judaism chose not to include it in their canon while they let it fade from their official teaching, the book didn't die. The Dead Sea Scrolls community treasured it. The Ethiopian communities, both Jewish and Christian, preserved it as scripture. And when European scholars finally encountered those Ethiopian manuscripts in the 18th and 19th centuries, when they began translating Jubilees back into European languages, something awakened in readers. They recognized something authentic, something ancient, something that had been missing from their understanding of the biblical narrative. The early Christian church fathers quoted from Jubilees. Epiphanius, Jerome, and others referenced it in their writings, treating it as an important source of information about the patriarchs and the angels. But as Christianity became institutionalized, as church councils met to determine which books were scripture and which weren't, Jubilees fell outside the accepted boundaries. Not because anyone proved it was false or heretical, but because it didn't fit the emerging consensus about what the Bible should contain. It was too Jewish for the increasingly Gentile church. It was too focused on calendars and festivals that most Christians no longer observed. It raised questions that the church preferred to leave unanswered. So it faded from use in Christian communities, just as it had faded from most Jewish communities, preserved only by those Ethiopian believers who recognized its value. And here's the beautiful irony, the divine comedy in all of this. The very act of trying to suppress the Book of Jubilees made it more precious to those who encountered it. When something is forbidden, when knowledge is restricted, when authorities tell you not to look, the human spirit naturally wants to see what they're hiding. Every generation that rediscovers Jubilees experiences that same thrill of accessing something that was almost lost, something that powerful people didn't want them to know. You're feeling it right now, aren't you? That sense of uncovering hidden wisdom, of being let in on secrets that were kept from your ancestors. That's not just excitement, that's your soul recognizing that truth cannot be permanently buried, that what is meant for you will find you no matter how many centuries or how many miles separate you from its source. What does the Book of Jubilees actually teach that's so valuable? Beyond the controversies, beyond the calendar debates and the angel stories, it presents a vision of absolute devotion to righteousness. It portrays the patriarchs as men of extraordinary holiness who kept the law even before it was given at Sinai, who observed the Sabbath and the festivals through some inner knowledge of what God required. It emphasizes the sanctity of the covenant relationship between God and Israel, The importance of separating from pagan practices, the beauty of living in alignment with divine order. It teaches that the entire universe operates according to laws written before creation, that there's a cosmic order underlying everything, and that human flourishing comes from aligning with that order rather than fighting against it. The book calls readers to a level of commitment that most religious systems find uncomfortable. It doesn't offer easy grace or simple formulas. It presents a demanding vision of righteousness that requires paying attention to details, to times and seasons, to purity and separation, to maintaining boundaries between the holy and the common. This kind of teaching doesn't fill mega-churches or attract casual followers. It appeals to people who want to go deeper, who are willing to organize their entire lives around spiritual truth, who see their faith not as one aspect of life, but as the organizing principle of all existence. And that's exactly the kind of person who kept this book alive through the centuries when institutions were letting it die. Perhaps what we learn from the story of the Book of Jubilees is that institutional religion and deep spirituality often walk different paths. The institution needs stability, consensus, control, clear boundaries around what is and isn't acceptable. The spiritual seeker needs exploration, mystery, the freedom to encounter truth in unexpected places, permission to ask difficult questions. The Book of Jubilees was too wild for the institution, too specific in its claims, too challenging to authority structures, too demanding of its readers. But for those who encountered it with open hearts, it provided exactly what they needed: a deeper understanding of the biblical narrative, a sense of cosmic order, a framework for making sense of history and destiny, a vision of what complete devotion to God might look like. Right now, in this moment, you're part of a lineage that stretches back thousands of years. You're connected to those Dead Sea Scrolls community members who carefully copied this text, to those Ethiopian scribes who preserved it through centuries, to those modern scholars who translated it and made it available again to the world. You're connected to everyone who ever chose to seek truth, even when authorities said not to look, everyone who valued wisdom over comfort, everyone who recognized that what is forbidden is often what is most necessary. The Book of Jubilees survived because people like you refused to let it die. And the reason you're drawn to this story, the reason you're still watching, the reason something in you resonates with this ancient text is because you carry that same spirit of seeking, that same hunger for truth that transcends institutional approval. Perhaps some knowledge wasn't forbidden because it was false, but because it demanded too much devotion, too much change, too much willingness to reorganize your life around spiritual truth, too much courage to stand apart from the majority and follow a path that leads through wilderness, places where institutions fear to tread. The Book of Jubilees survived because truth has a way of enduring, because what is real cannot be permanently hidden, because the human soul will always hunger for the depths, even when surface-level religion is all that's offered. And you, right now, sitting here having journeyed through this entire story with me, you are proof that the wisdom keepers were right to preserve this book, that their faith in future seekers was not misplaced. That forbidden knowledge will always find those who are ready to receive it.